introduce myself as well. So I'm Kelleigh Ryan. I'm a Cubby, an Australian South Sea Island woman. I'm also a psychologist, and I specialise in trauma. The interesting thing about talking today is I have to remind everyone that I speak only for myself and those I have the right to speak for. I don't speak for everyone. That's not how this works. And I wouldn't think of doing that. The other thing, and I'll just share my slides, hopefully. Let's see. Okay. You've got spoiler alert there, so I'll go to the one slideshow. Okay. So the other thing I wanted to say was I grew up understanding or being taught by my parents and my grandparents, and my grandparents were Aboriginal and Australian South Sea Islanders. So my grandfather's people came as slaves, and they came from an island called Goa. And so I learned old law both ways, and also Australian law. So one of the things that's always stood out for me is that our learning or punishments were about bringing balance and reciprocity. And if you weren't moving to rebalance what you had done, then punishment was not actually the whole answer. The idea was that you would learn what you had done and how you'd brought something out of balance and how to put it back into balance, be that relationship or goods or whatever, but it was always about balance. And that's what I found interesting when I went to boarding school as a child. Yes. So, yeah, and I guess for me, I spent this time going, hang on, why are you doing that when this makes more sense? But anyway, I digress. What is important about that is that when we talk about what is reasonable, and we're talking about personal judgment here, and in terms of having the ability to inflict harm on someone else as a way to get them to do something, we've got a big space around what makes up your worldview, what is reasonable for you. And what it does is it opens this space where your bias and your worldview are privileged. And often that causes problems because your prejudice, your racism, bias, all those things, when acted out in a hit or a smack or discipline, don't have a learning experience. They have a fear response. They have a fight, flight, freeze response. So totally not the type of thing you're trying to achieve. So if you remember that all resilience and learning happens in your frontal lobes, if you're smacking someone or harming them to get the message across, they're so not going to learn that because they don't have the right parts of their brain working for you. Yeah, and I hover on this for a little bit because when you understand the amount of racism that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and I'm only speaking for them, experience every day, you understand that there are muddy waters when we come to whose worldview and reasonable judgment, if we're going to go with that. The other thing is when we work with teachers, we talk about there's no such thing as bad behavior. Every behavior is driven by an intent. What is the behavior trying to tell you? You know, we don't exist in silos. We all have home lives and generations of gifts that are passed down. So understanding what is this child's behavior trying to tell me will be much more beneficial to you than harming someone. So, yes. And look, we're asked all the time, but isn't that deviant behavior? And actually, if it's a deviant behavior, so deviant behavior is out of the norm. If we're talking about norms, whose worldview are we talking about? Whose worldview are we privileging? And if there's another worldview in the room, you might want to know something about that before you make judgment, reasonable, personal judgment as to whether you will discipline, in what way you will discipline. The other thing I want to remind people is that punitive measures only bring compliance. I cannot talk enough about, if we're disciplining to change behavior, that will only change while we're there. So this locks you into a cycle of always being there to discipline or increasing your discipline until the person you're disciplining is acting out of fear. And look, you see this in school attendance, in activity attendance, in home, in being home. If you're being harmed under the guise of punishment at home, you will avoid being there. That's, you know, a really simple thing. And we see that across the board when it comes to children and fear in relation to being punished or harmed. So yeah, just remembering punitive measures only give compliance, and they lock you into this cycle of having to do the same thing. They don't give you that scope to actually step outside and say, well, how do I change this? What could I do differently? So the other thing we all know is, if you're disciplining, you're not being responsive, you're being reactive. Why? Because you're reacting to someone doing something you don't want them to do, or in your mind, they should know better than doing. So once again, you've got a physical and emotional response that hasn't got the whole of your brain engaged for you. So, you know, when we're highly aroused like that, we cross a line inadvertently. It's much easier when you're acting out of, whether that's anger, you know, whether that's fear, and you may not pull yourself up where you think you were going to, or you may do more damage than you think you did. And that makes it really difficult. It also makes it difficult for you to remember and to find a different way next time. So was I clear about that? I'm looking at Daryl's face and he's going, So
sorry, we're going to have to wrap up, and
Yep.
There is a question in the chat also, but can you just wrap up your bit, because we're up to time, unfortunately.
Yep, not a problem. So I think the other thing I really wanted to say, and I'll put these two things together, and that is, yes, if we're going to remove this, if we're going to get safety into our law, then we have to think about resourcing populations, you know, our priority populations. You know, let's not do what they did with removing alcohol and not giving support. Let's be prepared for this. Let's start to equip people with more support, more knowledge, and more ways of coping with this issue. Thank you.
Thanks, Kelleigh. And just Daryl, would you just like to ask your question? Because I think it's the only one in the chat for Kelleigh. And then if anybody has any immediate quick questions for Linda, please, yeah, write it in the chat and we'll try and answer it now.
Yeah, Kelleigh, I think your last point kind of goes to what I was asking about, and that is, if we adopt what Linda's calling for, of repealing the reasonable defence, is there anything in that that's going to be empowering or disempowering? Is there a risk that we're going to, you know, further entrench racism? But I think you've kind of partially answered it by talking about the issue of support. But over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't stress enough, if we're going to go there, trauma-informed practice and cultural safety must be Indigenous-led. And if, you know, the foundation of asking people with lived experience to help change the system, you have to understand that there needs to be extra support there as well. But yeah, don't just impose another worldview on us. We don't need it.
Thank you. Thanks, Daryl. Thank you, Kelleigh. Any questions for Linda before we wrap this section up? If you have, I presume, Linda and Kelleigh, you'll be open to ongoing communication from this group anyway, because yes, if there's any burning questions, I can't, I don't see anything new in the chat. Oh, hang on, wait. Sorry.
Feel free to come off mic if anyone wants to
Yes,
jump in.
Neaton, would you like to mention?
I was just coming into this workshop. I thought I'll have a chat with my wife and my daughter and about compliance and strict parenting. And my daughter was in grade 12, said a statement which I actually noted down. She said that strict parenting only raises good liars. Children still do their stuff, but they just don't do it in front of the parents. So, and that really resonated with me, and that's what I put in the chat.
Yes. Excellent point. Excellent point. Thank you.
If there's just one moment, can I just reinforce how important it is to talk the language that's used around this, because it's politicians that will repeal this law. And part of the package in other countries is the repeal of the law to send the very strong message that it is not acceptable as an act of love, as what was his name, Will Smith claimed, you know, for slapping Chris Rock. It's not the way to discipline children. It starts to lead that message, but also it puts children in just the same position as adults and makes consistent that message. But politicians are very, very scared around this issue, because if there's one thing they're frightened of, one institution they're most frightened of, it's the family. So just, we're not talking about banning anything. We're just repealing laws that would put children in the same position as adults. We're not making anything illegal. We're just putting children with the same protection. So I just really urge you to be careful around that language, not talking about a new offence. Okay.
Thank you, Linda. And that's so important for those of us who've been on this journey for a long time. Language is critical, and a good reminder for us for what might hopefully come next. Thank you so much, Kelleigh and Linda, for your time and for engaging with us. And we hope that you're going to be part of this team moving forward.